conversation piece with Patrick Armstrong. I am the titular Patrick, and this is a show where we talk about the missing pieces of the conversations we're already having. Shout out to all our returning listeners, and a high five and hello to everyone joining us for the very first time. Thank you so much. My guest today is a Korean-American hospital chaplain, author, and speaker whose reflections on trauma, grief, and advocating for all manner of people have helped countless individuals navigate their own journeys, myself included. He is also a 6th-degree black belt and a lover of Cuban food, cold brew, and old black and white noir films. It is my honor and privilege to welcome my friend Joon Park to the show. Hey, Joon, thanks for joining me.
Patrick, I am so happy to be here. And let me, you didn't put me up to this. Let me brag on you a little bit.
Okay.
Because I've been a fan of your work since forever, since like the first time I read anything you wrote. And I like you so much that I actually talked about you on another podcast.
Oh.
And I mentioned that you had like a great voice for radio, a great face for TV, and a great voice for radio. And you're the way that you write, the way that you advocate, just your whole life story, all of it has been so inspiring and deeply just moving for me to see and to read. I mean, I'm a fan of your work. I'm a fan of your voice. And so I'm just happy to be here sitting with you. You didn't put me up to this, by the way, before we before you hit record. I just want to lift you up. And for everybody who's listening, they got to know, like, I'm a super big fan of your work. I think you do amazing, amazing advocacy. I'm really, really happy to be here. Honestly, really, really happy.
Dang, I'm going to be honest, you're catching me off guard here. Normally, right after I introduce somebody, I give our listeners context for the relationship that I have with the guest, and I was not prepared for you to compliment me in that way. Thank you so much for saying that. That really means a lot, because I will say the exact same things back to you. I think ever since coming across your Instagram account and, diving into the work that you've done around these different topics, I think I've really resonated with the way you speak and the way that your voice translates through your written word. And then listening to the interviews and the podcasts and the different things that you've done, like literally hearing the words from the page become manifest in your voice has been so powerful for me, because it's helped inform and influence the way that I approach the work and the advocacy that I do. And so, as much as you're a fan, you may be a fan of me. I am equally a fan of you and the things that you have done, because I think the things that you do are such a guide and a beacon for folks who are just trying to find the ways and the language to articulate what they're going through. And I think you come through so authentically that it really helps people see that, one, it's okay to do something like that and to speak so vulnerably, and two, that you're not alone in the way that you feel and the way that you might be approaching the things that you're going through. So thank you for saying that. I really appreciate that. And, it's reciprocated in every sense of the word.
Patrick, thank you. And if I can say one more thing, first of all, thank you for saying all of that. Very kind of you. And we got to meet last summer.
We did.
Yeah. And, like when I was meeting you, can I be truthful? I was a little bit starstruck, because I was like, dang. Oh. This is Patrick Armstrong here. Because like you still write a lot, but I was like reading a lot of your stuff then, just like I read your stuff now. And like, I was like, I feel like I know you a little bit before I met you,
Yeah.
So like, and then I would wait for your post, because I think at that time you were writing like every day almost on Instagram.
Probably, yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So I was like, I would wait for your post, because I was always like, dang, I wonder what Patrick thinks about this thing. And then you would write on it. Or like you would write something and I'm like, oh, okay, this is really, I didn't know about this little perspective. So like when I met you, I was a little bit nervous actually, because I was like, I had this idea of you and you maybe had an idea of me. And when you're like friends online for a while and you meet in real life, that's like a thing that happens now, where it's just like, there's nervousness like both ways, I guess.
100%.
So then when I met you, I was like, I don't know what to say now. There's so much I want to talk about. And then I remember when we said goodbye, when I was leaving DC, I was like, do you remember that moment where I was just like looking at you like, all right, man.
Yeah, 100%.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, 100%.
Like, I was like, dang, you're so cool. I don't want to leave. Also, I don't know what to say. Also, I hope to see you. Get like a lot of layers of feelings,
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I'm just saying that because like, you're talking about my stuff or my platform or whatever, but you need to know, like, I was nervous meeting you. I was starstruck. I'm still like starstruck in that way. I really look up to you, Patrick. So you got to
I'm
know, and your listeners got to know.
I'm gonna be honest. Like, I almost don't even know how to respond to that. That I don't. Okay, so I just came back from Korea and I had some similar experiences with folks who only know me from Instagram. And like you said, we're meeting people who we've been friends with online now in real life.
Yeah.
And those interactions, I feel like kind of that awkwardness to like have that conversation and have people come up and share similar sentiments and compliments. And it's just like, it's interesting to it's an interesting relationship to navigate. And I 100% remember like us moving in our separate directions after we were leaving the Unity event. And I do, it's just like, it's like, how do you say goodbye? Because there's so much more conversation that you want to have. And I really remember that conversation and the conversations we had that day, because like those were some of the first in-person ones that I had outside of the adoptee community that really made me feel the connection and similarities and overlap between myself as an adoptee and someone else who is Korean American, a child and from a family of immigrants who had like a shared experience in that way, in terms of what it means to navigate your identity, what it means to embrace your culture or reject your culture, and try and figure out your way through that from adolescence to adulthood. And I really remember resonating with a lot of the things that you were sharing, because I felt like a lot of my friends were coming around too. And then you were sharing like your journey through the chaplaincy, and it was, I felt like it was like you were really reaching a lot of people who either wanted to pursue something similar or just had a lot of questions about that. And to hear then to be kind of a fly on the wall as you shared your story with them, it was just really powerful to be able to be in that same physical space as you when you were having that conversation. So like the starstruck, the awe, all of it all, again, reciprocated. I feel like we're in a compliment off right now.
Yeah,
And I'm
this
just
whole
trying
podcast episode will be literally 4 hours of just going back and
Yes.
forth, thinking of ways to compliment each other.
It really would be. But I want to be mindful of your time. And again, can't thank you enough for sitting down to have this conversation with me. And before we dive into, whatever the missing piece of the thing we're about to talk about is, I introduced you a little bit, but for anybody who's listening who may not know you or the work that you do you mind sharing just a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, as you had mentioned, Patrick, I'm a hospital chaplain. This month will have been 8 years since I've been a hospital chaplain. And part of my work, I'm at 1,000+ bed level 1 trauma center, is that we do grief counsel. We attend every single death and code blue. We attend to all the level 1 traumas, which include car accidents, gunshot wounds, stabbings, fire, fall, stroke. And we also talk about end of life care, such as decision making, advanced directives, um, living will, which is about if you end up on life support, what is your expressed wishes at that time. And so we do a whole range of different duties, and probably have seen hundreds, if not thousands, of those my patients dying or have died. And so it is a difficult work. And at the same time, as strange as it is to say, I love the work that I do. And so during that time, I was also working, I worked for 3 years at a nonprofit for the unhoused. And so there I was a staff care chaplain, because, if you're working at a nonprofit and you're serving under resourced communities, there's going to be burnout. So I was a chaplain for the employees there. And yeah, Patrick, it's like I was saying, it's really, really hard work. It's just unthinkable and sometimes incomprehensible, like the things that I've seen, the range of what I've seen. But I can't imagine doing anything else. I really feel like this is the work that I'm called to do and where I belong.
I appreciate you sharing that. I think that's one of the things that really has struck me about your writing in particular, is that you approach it with this level of vulnerability and intentionality and care when talking about all of these experiences, because this is like really heavy stuff. And I don't think you shy away from the heaviness. And I think that you approach it with a mindfulness that we don't see very often. Because I think at the end of the day, you know, you're experiencing all of these things with all of the hundreds of thousands of people that you have to go through this and walk down this path with. And I think a lot of us could take that for granted when telling that story to a very wide, broad audience like it is on social media. And I think it's really interesting to experience it as a viewer, as an audience member, when you share just how difficult some of these moments are and the takeaways that you have from those experiences. When did you first realize that this was something that you could do in terms of sharing about these things publicly? And was there a moment that made you realize, like, oh, I think I could do this on social media and that it may have a greater impact or a wider ripple effect with people when I share some of these things?
Yeah, I don't think I set out to like be authentic guy online sharing vulnerably, you know. Um yeah, so sometimes I'll get asked that like hey, how did you build your platform? And I don't know how to reverse engineer that, like I don't know the specific things that I did, but I can say like I've learned over time that I have a thin skin and I've learned to own my thin skin.
Mm,
Like I just wear my heart out in the open. And um I can't the thing that makes my heart that open is I think also what makes me a chaplain and makes me at least specifically fully human. And I can't help it really, you know. Heart is
yeah.
just always open. My skin is so thin, like all feedback affects me, encouragement moves me deeply. I still weep sometimes reading the news. Um, every time I walk into a patient encounter 8 years later, sometimes people ask me, like, have you gotten used to it? And my answer is always no. I've never gotten over seeing death and dying. And I think the way that I express myself online is probably the same way that just maybe my disposition is. And, in fact, when I did my interview for my residency, which was now, gosh, 6, 7 years ago, the supervisors, the chaplains were a little worried and they were like, hey, are you going to be okay with the amount of work that you got to do? Because this residency is very intense. It's a year-long program. And at the end, we officially become chaplains, or I guess we get our CPE units. And what I said was, I can't shut down the mothership, the heart,
Mm.
because then I can't do the work. It shuts down all the other ships. So I'm going to manage myself with self-care. Got to process that out in therapy. I have a good community. I'm very, very lucky to have all those resources and people. But I can't shut down the thing that makes me a chaplain and a human.
Mm.
And so I think they liked that answer because I did get into the residency. But yeah, Patrick, it's not something that I set out to do. I know lately that vulnerability has become kind of commodified and commercialized, unfortunately. But it's not something that I'm consciously aware of. I think when I sit down and write about these encounters, details always altered for privacy. The main thing that I'm trying to do is connect with people because it's stories that bring us together.
Mm.
And I'm thinking this is valuable wisdom and experience. And can we share this in this community together? Because maybe in this way that grief was unlocked and that vulnerability was made safe, you would know a way or an avenue or a path, safety to be able to feel deeply into your grief, into your vulnerability too. And I think the more we can do that, the better and more healed we become.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really powerful. Did you always have an affinity for storytelling in this way? Or were you always aware that you kind of did wear your heart on your sleeve in the manner that you described?
Yeah, yes to both. So, like when I was real young, right? And I feel like I've told this story before, but when I was real young, I would carry around this like notepad, and like this is when I was like learning English, and had forgotten. It was like a weird transition between forgetting my Korean and learning English. But I was learning English. I had this notepad out, and there was this lake near like my dad's business, and I would write down stories about the ducks that were in the pond in the
Mm.
lake. And I just liked writing stories, you know, and I originally wanted to write fiction. In my early 20s, I sent out a bunch of proposals for like books I was writing. So I made up this whole thing about, I saw this one little baby duck where it was kind of swimming sideways a little bit. So here's this mother duck with all the baby ducks. And I wrote a whole story about why this little baby duck was swimming sideways. And I said, because of the water pollution and because, you know, the climate stuff. And like, I was like really, really into it. And then I had a twist reveal. The twist reveal is that the ducks themselves were polluting the water. You know, it wasn't it was like, you know, oh, we are our own greatest enemy type of thing.
Right.
And so, I mean, I've always loved storytelling. And I think it's Barry Lopez in one of his books says stories have a way of taking care of us. My father and mother, the way that they would talk to me, and maybe this is an Eastern Asian thing or part of our culture, is they wouldn't necessarily talk to me in lessons, like not in a kind of dogmatic, didactic way, but they would tell me a story. And then at the end of it, almost leave it to me to understand what they were saying, almost kind of like Aesop's fables. It's a very Eastern way of storytelling. In fact, I would hear sometimes in Christian circles, like Chinese immigrants, when they would come and learn to preach to American Christians, they would literally have to change their way of thinking, the Chinese immigrants would, because they were used to storytelling, and then at the end, you add this kind of like one line, and that's the whole lesson. It recontextualizes the entire story that you just heard, right? Almost like Aesop's fables, right? Or even Jesus's parables.
Sure.
But then when you go get into like Western academia, it's all about here are the 3 points in the supporting evidence. And, you know, one point logically concludes to another. It's like almost like climbing a ladder to make your point. That's a very American westernized way of thinking. And it takes, in my opinion, we need both. But if you only do this sort of academic logical progression, this sequence of argumentation, you're really removing the soul out of the people that we're talking about. Then it just becomes data. And at some point, you're just giving numbers and stats and facts. But you're not really talking about the people involved and the things that happened to them, what they felt and experienced, and what that means for this person and their community. And so I think my dad and mom inadvertently, as they shared these stories every night, they would tell me a different story. You know, they would tell me all these Korean folk tales and things like that. They were telling me that a way to understand and even to love people is to know the story that they're living and where they come from. And so for me, that storytelling was incredibly, I think, monumental and pivotal in the way that I understood the world. And it is very much an Eastern and Asian way of communication. And I think, at least in Western academia, some of that is lost in the way that we use argumentation. Needed, but can't be the only way in which we communicate.
I think it's really interesting, you know, thinking about how specifically immigrants from East Asian countries, or maybe just Asia in general, come over and have to literally change the way that they think about telling a story in order to conform maybe to the Western idea of what it means to be a storyteller. And I think that really lines up with a lot of the things that I've been talking about since starting this journey for myself as a storyteller, because I think something that we miss, especially as Western storytellers, is the privilege that it is to tell someone's story. And not only to tell it, but to be on the receiving end of someone's story. I think we've gotten to this point where it feels like we're entitled to someone's everything. So, like, not only tell me what your name is, but tell me where you came from. Tell me where your family's from. Tell me all these things that you've went through. And it feels like a lot of times we're demanding that information instead of understanding and recognizing, oh, this person has just gotten real vulnerable with me in any way. And I think I share that a lot on the show and on the John Chi show is just like, you know, what I've come to understand is it's a privilege for anybody to tell you anything about themselves. And I think that's really interesting that you bring that up, because I do think we can't really understand and show people empathy and love if we don't understand the story behind them, if we don't have that extra context of what it means to be that particular person. Because I think we like to generalize stories as well.
Yeah,
And
and you know what? Generalize, and maybe even as bad or worse than that, we tell other people's stories for them or
yes,
over them.
yes,
And so, one example, and this is kind of a microcosm that I see, is I may have a patient who has certain wishes and desires about their treatment, about how they want to die. And then you have family coming in, and I know that they're all well intentioned, but each of them also have different ideas and opinions about how they want their loved one to be treated and how they want them to die. And so then very often I'm in rooms, and this is why they train us in family dynamics. Very often I'm in rooms with maybe a dozen different opinions
mm,
about what this patient wants, what their loved one wants. But in the end, my thought is, what does the patient want?
right,
Can we really just override their wishes and their desires? They have autonomy, they have capacity, they have a heart and mind and a desire about what they would like their care to be. And so sometimes our stories get told for us. I mean, we were kind of talking about this just a little bit, Patrick. But even in the ways in which we perceive our own stories as Asian Americans,
mm,
um, there's been a lot of talk already about the model minority myth, but a lot of that has been internalized into thinking that I am, silent and I just keep my head low. Or is that but really, I think that was something that was told to us about what we
right,
do. But really, if we look at our history, we've always protested, we've always spoken up, we've always advocated. There's always been solidarity, and there's always been voices crying out whenever we've been oppressed. So even things like, when it comes to grief, I've heard very often that Asian Americans or Asians are kind of, I guess, reserved in their grief, or we don't want emotions. And there's some of that's true. I think that there's a little bit of cultural dysfunction in that if we're too emotional or something like that, we're not stoic, or we're,
mm,
we're not at peace and things like that. But every Asian family that I've seen with their deceased loved one, there has been wailing and screaming, even rolling on the floor, um, lots and lots of venting and shouting and expression. And so I think that when we have someone else tell our stories for us, oh, they're so reserved, they're so quiet, they're so polite, that's something that can actually get in our heads. And we can start to believe that narrative. And it really does become this strange feedback loop of what I
right.
think that I should be, or what I think that my people and my community are. Patrick, I'm sure you experience in the adoptee community stories that people put on you.
100%.
Yeah, I'm sure you know that already. I mean, yeah, I mean, stories that people assume about you. And it's because other people who should not have been telling your story have taken your microphone and your pen and are now writing your story for you. And so when it comes to grief, when it comes to our culture, when it comes to the stories that we've lived, it's important that um, we recognize it's not just a privilege and an honor to hear this person's story, but also to not speak when that person is speaking,
Right.
because there is a way of silencing someone that is wrong. There's a way that silence can be used, which is wrong. But there's also a way that silence can be used in which it's uplifting and elevating the other person.
Right.
So which silence will we choose? And I think the most important thing for me as a chaplain is when a patient is speaking, I'm going to use my silence for this person, not against this person. And that is a
Mm,
very intentional choice each of us have to make.
I love that. I think that's something that I've not heard articulated very often. And it's something that I'm really like chewing and processing on right now in this moment. And I think that's what I want to ask you about. I think that's right there is a piece that is missing from this conversation, not even from the Asian American perspective, but just from a storytelling perspective and a advocacy perspective in general for every marginalized, historically marginalized identity and community is how are we going to use silence to uplift and elevate? And I appreciate you naming that. And I want to call it the missing piece. And I want to ask you, how do we move towards the appropriate way of using silence in the way that you just described? How do we get there as Asian Americans, as just individuals who maybe don't have or who have been so taught and told over and over and have internalized this message of oh, well, I'm using my silence to then silence you and to cause outward harm, even if we don't realize we're doing that and it's unintentional. How do we move away from that in order to use silence as this platform to uplift?
Yeah, Patrick, that is an incredible question. And I think it's such a big question because we're talking about a lot of different spaces, right? Because there's the
Right.
online platform,
Right.
a way in which we can listen. Sometimes there's a news event that happens, like the recent with the finding out of, the Blind Side movie was basically a fiction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. How do we actively listen to something like that and use our silence for instead of against? And then also when it comes to provider and patient, when it comes to friendships, when it comes to parenting, when it comes to marriage, when it comes to crises, mental health. Um, yeah, there's so many different situations. And so what I've always found, and this is kind of, I guess, I'm hoping that this covers a lot of them.
Sure. I mean,
But
you're right. It
maybe,
is very big.
yeah,
Like it is
yeah.
very broad.
But
And I
yeah,
wonder I wonder what even those just initial steps might be.
yeah, yeah. Here's what I've always noticed is that when someone does find the courage and the space and platform to tell their story, when I'm sitting with a patient and they start telling me their story about their fears, their anxieties, how they got to the hospital, what they hope for, I notice that when they say something, if I immediately respond to them and reply to them, I notice something that I personally call the grand closing. They just realize not, it wasn't malicious on my part, but they're like, okay, um, this person, I know what they're really feeling and thinking about this. So I can't say much more. But anytime somebody says a few sentences, and I just hold and pause, I just hang back a little bit. They may say a little bit more. Maybe that's to fill the awkwardness of the silence,
Mm, yeah.
Or maybe they just feel like, you know what, there is more. And you know what, Patrick, there is always more. There's always more. And sometimes after 3, 4 pauses, like I get the real story, like I
Mm.
get the real thing that they're thinking and they're feeling. And I think it would be beneficial for all of us, and I preach this most to myself, that we wait and listen longer than we can bear it, you know, longer than we even feel comfortable with. Before we insert our advice, our opinion, before we insert feedback, before we give our perspective, before we, even if all those things are true, even if my advice is good, to just hang back 3 or 4 beats, to sort of hang back for 3 or 4 minutes, or to allow the space for this person to stay open. Because I've seen the looks in patients and families, their eyes and their body language, the way they hold their shoulders. If I know that I've replied too soon, or
Mm.
even if I just draw my breath in a certain way, because those rooms can be so still, even if I move a certain way, I can just see the patient close up. And I've gotten a lot better at that, I think, through the years. Not that I don't think I was terrible at it, but there are times when I just feel like, oh man, like I should have just waited just another second because now we're on this other thing, and I wanted to go back to the thing that they were saying. So yeah, if we could just wait that extra few beats to really, really get the whole story, because I think it's when people feel safe that they start to dig deeper and deeper, and then finally you get to the real thing, and then here's where they're at.
I love that. I think that is excellent advice. Something that, we've talked about on the show a lot about listening to understand instead of responding. Because a lot of us will hear something in what someone is saying, will load up a response to that thing, and we'll miss a lot of the extra context that comes through. And then, like you said, we're not even taking a beat. We're like right on the answer. It's like, all right, here I go. I have my response here. And another thing that it made me think about is this idea of the safe space and the brave space. Essentially, you talked about vulnerability being commodified. And I feel like it's almost become like a buzzword in a way. And we don't treat it with the reverence that it deserves when it comes to someone being vulnerable. And I feel like safe space has become that too. Because I feel like, again, when someone finds safety, there are times where we now, I feel like, can expect them to be brave at the same time, to move out of safety and tell us, like, how did you get here? How did this happen for you? like to lead us down the path when maybe they're not ready to share yet. Maybe they're not ready to dive in to go in that direction. And so the concept for me has been, how do we not only provide safety for someone to find their identity, to unpack their lived experience, and how do we take safety and then empower them to be brave and to enter the space of bravery where they can start to share in whatever way that makes sense for them. And I feel like even in those moments of silence, that is the empowerment. I feel like you've just given me language for how we can transition that gap, bridge between safety and bravery. Because I think we always want to demand of someone to, now that you've found safety, okay, tell your story, tell your story, tell your story, instead of allowing them to be processing, do the unpacking, do that internal work, and then sitting back, hanging back for a beat, for 10 beats, and then letting them understand that I can move there myself instead of having you take me there when maybe I'm not ready.
Yeah. You know, Patrick, that's something I've been thinking about a lot. In fact, if I were to like take it from a view from the sky, like there is a tendency, I think, for individuals and communities to, whether intentionally or not, moralize or judge someone out of the grid of our own growth. And so I have done so much to get where I'm at. Now I'm welcoming you into the community. But for some reason, whether it's out of like, I really want you to get this, or there's a desperation to help, or out of judgment, it's like, I'm going to give you only this much time to get where I'm at. Even though it took me 10 years to find this community and arrive at these conclusions and this worldview, well, you're going to get about 10 minutes, or
Right.
You got to take this program, you get 4 seminars, and then you got to be one of us. And so I think that also works in, for example, once I've seen this a lot in the Asian American community, and I think this is true for maybe many people of color, like once Mount Assimilation is climbed, right? Once an Asian American gets to the top, it's like they want to pull up the ladder or be like, you got to do all the work that I did, to get where I'm at. Or like, I've talked with some Asian Americans who are like, yeah, I've never experienced racism. I never had to struggle. This is a great country. And I'm like, man, did you forget what it was like? And also like, I basically want to tell them like, I think you've forgotten the people behind you because it reminds you of how much you did struggle. Or, there's a lot of trauma wrapped in that and there's a lot of reasons. And so whatever explanation is there, and I want to think optimistically, maybe it's just this community is so wanting and desiring to help that they see someone new and they immediately try to rush them towards the same conclusions they've arrived at. And I think there's a danger there in that if we forget the struggle, we may start to moralize and say, why aren't you moving faster? But then we got to look at ourselves, like, how long did it take us for our fractures to heal? Right? How long did it take us to the people that we had to meet, the experiences that we needed to have, the natural and organic unfolding of all these revelations? It took a long time. It took a lot of effort. And to expect that then for the people who are now coming alongside, there is good intention there, but it's good intention with rushed hands. And so, yeah, I think to kind of answer your point, to kind of respond to that point, I think we're all in sort of my optimistic explanation is that we want so badly for others to see what we see and to just come to the sort of freedom and liberation that we have, that we may inadvertently hurt people by rushing them and not recognizing, wait, they're fractured. They can't keep up with this pace, and I'm still not totally healed yet. I can't speak out of the stuff that I'm still working through. And I can't make this person my project as a way to save myself either. And so there's a lot of psychological and sort of personal reasons that happens. And so I think we not only need to be slow enough to listen to this other person's story, but slow enough to listen to ourselves and our own motivations.
I love that because I feel like that's the period of life that I'm in right now. Is I think when I came back from Korea, I just had a lot of revelations, a lot of like emotional breakthroughs. And one of the things that I realized was that a lot of the stuff that I've been sharing of my own story online was maybe not, I think that I was characterizing it as having been done. and I was through the work of whatever it was that I was talking about, whether it be reconciling with the fact that I'll never have any information about my first family, or like I've done all this identity work and now I've reached acceptance, and I don't need to move past here. So I'm sharing all of this outwardly for people because it feels like they're resonating. They're telling me that it's resonating. But one of the things that I realized in Korea was like, okay, I don't know that I am there yet with a lot of this stuff. And I'm realizing now for the first time in a long time, since I started this journey at least, that I don't know that I've been listening to myself. And I have been trying to project this inner voice that I've needed to listen to onto other people, and trying to get them to do the things that I myself have not been doing. And I think that revelation has been powerful. And one of the reasons that I've stepped away from sharing my own personal story more publicly now is just because I'm like, there's some work here that needs to be done. And like you said, I'm not fully healed to the point where I can necessarily be saying the things that I'm saying. And because I don't actually maybe believe those things that I'm doing. But I want other people who are resonating with this work to do those things themselves.
Yeah.
And maybe that's because I want them to do the work for me instead of me doing the work for myself.
Yeah. And you know what, Patrick? I think what's so important is that, in every community like this that you find, everybody's going to be at different stages and phases. Everybody's
Right.
going to be at a different, part of the track. It doesn't mean anybody is more ahead or behind. We're just in different places, right? And
100%.
and I'm sure you found yourself, maybe in this area you've gotten the growth that you wanted, and maybe in this area, hey, room for improvement, right? But the encouragement that I want to give you and to anybody who's listening is, we need all those different people in that community.
Right.
We need all those different stages to convene together and to find a way to hear each other. So like, this is some years back, I was in a Zoom meeting or some online meeting where different people were trying to organize a rally. And what I noticed in this room is that it involved racial justice. One person was all about, I want to be unified. I've invited law enforcement to speak, and then everybody had question marks around that. I want us to get together, and the way that he was speaking was basically he was ready for unity. He was ready for all of us to be one. There was another person who was so angry, and just like, they won't stop killing us. We need justice now. We need to defund. Abolition. All of that. Was angry and said, I'm not ready to hear anything about unity right now. And then there was another person who was talking about, hey, how can we get the city on our side to gather resources for those who are under-resourced? Thinking about it from a logistical point of view. And so what I recognized in that meeting was they were kind of all right in some way.
Sure.
Maybe not all the methods were right. Maybe not all the words that were said were kind, which is okay. But we needed all of those voices in that room. Nobody was necessarily wrong. We also did not get law enforcement that day, which I was kind of, that would have maybe not been great for that rally.
Sure.
Yeah. Anyway, all that to say, Patrick, like, we need all the different stages and phases in each community, and we need the different parts of ourself, the parts that have met that growth, the parts that have healed and reconciled, and then the other parts that are still struggling and wrestling, still angry. We still need the rage and the sorrow, just as we need like the, hey, I found peace in this, or I found growth in this. And, I think that just requires compassion for one another and compassion for all the different parts of ourselves.
I really appreciate that. I'm walking away from this conversation with a lot to think about, a lot to chew on. And I feel like every time that I talk to you, I come away with something like that. And I really appreciate it. I really appreciate every time that I get a chance to sit down and speak with you, because I learned so much. And, this is a short conversation, and I feel like you've done a lot of, if not educating others, at least educating myself on a lot of these things that I've been struggling with recently. A lot of things that I've been going through and processing for myself in my own journey. And, I'm excited to sit and think about some of these things a little bit more deeply, especially as I go through this therapy journey that I've started recently, and really give myself grace on both ends. What's been healed, what still needs to heal. And I think that's really important for me. And I hope that anybody listening who might be in a similar space recognizes that as well. And I just want to say, even in this conversation, the education that you're providing, that's labor. It's mental, emotional, even physical labor for you to sit here and have this conversation and share these anecdotes, these bits of advice. And I really, really appreciate it. And at the end of the day, we have to also give time for ourselves to learn from other people. So I want to ask you, who are you learning from right now? Who's giving you inspiration? Who's inspiring you, helping you reframe your perspective? Who are those folks?
Oh, man. Patrick, number one, you, of course. I knew I had to come back around to that, man. So thank you for that.
I wasn't setting him up for that, folks. Yeah. I know that you've listened to this. You've heard other people say a similar answer, but I do not set that up on purpose.
Oh, you were waving like a $5 bill, and hey, $5 is good enough for me, man. You would have held up 100.
What's your Venmo?
Yeah. No, for real. For you, of course. I feel like I always point out this one person just because, man, I love her so much. I read all her stuff. Like I feel like I read and reread it. Liz Kleinrock of Teach and Transform is just a person that I can I can sit for hours and just read all her content. And by the end of it, feel charged and ready for the world. Like I just love her and her content. I definitely want to lift her up. And then, man, I really like Cam, Therapy Redeemed.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, we had a conversation the other day. Just a private conversation, just talking, he and I, and he is just the coolest dude, and like he seems so like peaceful. When I talked with him after I was done, I felt like we're just talking as friends, but I was like, man, it felt like I had therapy or something. Like he just brings that centeredness,
100%.
Yeah. I really like him. And you know what? I share almost every single one of his posts. Dante Stewart is.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, man. I love Dante Stewart. He's just, I don't want to embarrass him, but he's been so encouraging to me personally. Just really, really encouraging. Times when I wasn't feeling good, just, hey, how are you? That kind of thing.
Sure.
And, we were talking about, Patrick, online friends. It's a weird space, right? Because we can be friends with somebody and never have met them in real life. It's just this kind of newer thing. But to me, those online relationships, to me, they're real and they're whole, And to have somebody that I kind of don't know, but I feel like I know, just reach out and say, how are you? It's like, it means the world. And so I just got to lift up Dante Stewart. Stu, if you're listening, I love you, man.
That is amazing. Love Dante Stewart's work. Definitely influential on a lot of the things that I do for myself, and everybody knows how I feel about Liz. She's been a guest on the show, was the first guest for our APAM Conversation series. Love Liz and everything that she does. I totally agree. Feeling charged and ready to take on the world every time that she shares something, and it's that perfect balance, I feel like, of emotion, of energy, and of the facts, and the I don't know, the other word for facts, I guess. Just that data, coming with that real lived experience, and then putting the appropriate amount of energy, emphasis, and emotion into what that work is. And then Cam, I was actually going to bring him up before we got out of here because of all the people that I follow and take inspiration from. Both yourself and him are the two who have most influenced me in terms of how I handle people in my comment section or people in the DMs who maybe don't come from a place of love. And I feel like both of you two do it differently, but also have this approach of empathy that is just really, really rare, especially in an online space, to see so frequently and so over and over and modeled in that way. And yeah, love Cam. I I can only imagine the kind of conversation you were both having. I can only imagine how incredible that was. So thank you for sharing those, folks. We'll definitely have their work linked here in the show notes as well. And I want to be mindful of your time. And again, I can't thank you enough for sitting down and having this conversation with me. So one last question. How does this audience support you going forward?
Oh, that's so kind of you, Patrick. I think, you know what? I should draw better boundaries, but I read every message that I get on Instagram, both good and bad. I'm thankful that it's good. I guess this is a weird way to answer your question, but I do just want to say thank you to anyone who's ever sent me any kind, even if I wasn't able to reply and I could just do an emoji or, click the double thing make the little heart there.
Oh yeah.
To show, hey, I see
reaction.
you. Yeah. Like I'm just so thankful to everyone who has supported me in that way. Because, I've written publicly on things like my wife miscarrying, or one of my childhood friends who died this year. My car broke down last week. Things like that. I just get messages. I'm so lucky, Patrick. I don't know how I got this lucky. I get messages from people that don't know me, but just write the most encouraging things, and I read all of it, all the advice and feedback, and I'm lucky that 98% of it, maybe 97, is very, very kind. So yeah, and I guess I'm not saying like, hey, everybody message me. Well, what I am trying to say is I am thankful. I already feel so supported. I feel like the community that I see online is just so supportive. And again, I'm so thankful and grateful for that. But yeah, on Instagram and maybe a little less so on Facebook, but mostly Instagram. Sure. Sometimes on Twitter or what's now called, I don't even know what's called now.
X. I think it's X.
I said tweet the other day and I was like, oh wait, I better correct myself. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I love that answer. I think I've been getting really unique answers to this support question, and I love every single one of them, and I love that one. Before we close it out, I am going to hype you up a little bit. One of the other ways you can support Joon is buy his book, The Voices We Carry. Still available. Make sure you go out and get that. That's one of the ways that we support the works that are created. I also know you're working on a second book that'll come out sometime in the near future, I hope. So
yeah, next year, May. Okay, May 2024. Perfect. Yep.
Perfect. So when the pre-orders for that drop, make sure that you are getting on them pre-orders because that's important for authors especially. But just supporting the people in our community, the people who are doing amazing things like yourself. This is another way that we can do that. So outside of 60% of people sending messages that are listening to this, so your inbox isn't overly flooded, but also going out, give him a follow, purchase his book, get ready to pre-order that second book. Those things are important as well. We'll have links for all of those things in the show notes too. Joon, thank you so much for sitting down and having this conversation. We've had to reschedule a couple of times because capacity is a real thing. And, I appreciate you being flexible and being willing to come back on when we've had to reschedule. And I appreciate you just being upfront and honest with me about the capacity and the limits that you carry, because I think it's important to model that for myself, for everybody, to know that you don't have to say yes to everything. And even if you said yes to something that you can, it's okay if you have to reschedule or even cancel it completely, it happens. We're all human, we're all people, we all have things going on in our lives. And so I just really appreciate that we were able to find this time to sit down and do this for this particular show. It means a lot to me. Yeah, Patrick, thank you for your graciousness, for your time. And much love to you. Everyone who's listening, much love to you as well. I appreciate it. For everybody out there, if you want to follow us, you can do so on Instagram at Conversation Podpiece. If you do feel inclined to leave a rating or review on whatever player you're listening to this on right now, we would greatly appreciate that. And if you're interested in supporting the show in the future in any way, feel free to hop in our DMs or visit our website, conversationpeacepod.com. Until next time, I'm Patrick Armstrong, and this has been Conversation Piece. Thanks, Joon. Thank you.